Welcome back to the Health Physics Society's video series, Pursuing the Truth and Promoting Transparency, regarding the historical foundations of the current radiation protection philosophy based on a linear no-threshold theory for cancer risk assessment. I'm Dr. John Cardarelli, President of the Health Physics Society. In the 17th episode, we learned about the many limitations of Lewis's 1957 science paper and that a J-shaped dose response was consistently observed for leukemia among atomic bomb survivors through the 1970s. In this episode, Dr. Calabrese shares his views on how Lewis was able to publish his study in the journal Science, and the powerful influences steering science to support a political narrative. You may even be surprised by Lewis's 1959 congressional testimony, not by what he said, but what he didn't say. Let's watch.
And one of the members on the Bayer pathology medical panel was one of the leading publishers on that, and indicated that that was one of his criticisms of the study that Lewis had, was that he should have mentioned that there was alternative causation, and Lewis would either ignored it, didn't know what to do, didn't have other people on. He's working by himself for the most part, and so what happens is that this paper that has so many flaws to it, so much bias involved in it, gets published in Science. Now, how does it get published in Science? I mean, how does it get, it's kind of like we go back to Muller gets published in Science with no data. And now, and it's a very powerful study. It changes the world, right? And now you have 30 years later, we have a really corrupt study, this now, by Lewis, that now transforms how EPA and other people think. It fuses with that 1956 science paper by the Bayer Committee and becomes a powerful synergistic duo to really transform the regulatory community. And so how does it get into Science? And well, now I don't know exactly how it got in, but I can tell you for sure that Science had 6 senior editors at that time. One of those 6 was a member of the Bayer genetics panel, and who was Muller's graduate student. His name was Bentley Glass. And right after the Lewis paper was published, Bentley Glass publishes his own paper in Science, strongly endorsing the conclusions of the Ed Lewis paper. And so the connections are striking in terms of, well, how do you take over a field? Well, you do it with power, and power in the right places. The Rockefeller Foundation, high-level editors at Science, people who let data in, papers in without data, people who let papers in that are corrupt. And then you have Science editors who will never want to retract papers that they've published in their journal that are corrupt. There's a problem with leadership in this country on this issue.
On Science itself.
That's right.
I'm very concerned about that.
And let me just say one other thing on Ed Lewis, and because everything breaks down to honesty and trust within Science. And so in 1959, Lewis goes and he testifies now for the 2nd time in front of Congress. And so he says, since 1957 publication of my paper, 3 more papers have come out and they've all supported my conclusions. And so now, when a professor from Caltech goes and says something, well, they could never be wrong. And who would even challenge them, right? But I decided to take a look at the 3 papers that he cited. Each of the 3 papers that he cited that came after his paper in 1957, each of them refuted his position. Refuted his position. He cites them as supporting it. He claims they are supporting it. And each one, in fact, one was up on the screen. It was the original study that showed the dip, and he's saying that supported my paper. It's actually the opposite of his paper. One is a study with a new study with the radiologist in Britain, which actually showed its own version of a J-shaped dose response, and the like. Either he was told this was true, he's deceptive, or I don't know. I just don't know how he did his work, because it was so flawed. that if anybody had really, a graduate student had turned that into me, and I did my analysis like I'd have done now, they wouldn't have made it through. They wouldn't have made it through. And this makes it through science. It doesn't just make it through science, it transforms the world. So what kind of analysis are regulatory agencies such as EPA and others that have relied upon this and never offer any of these kinds of criticisms for the papers that our entire policies are based on? What makes it worse here is that Lewis, because of his newly acquired prestige, he gets appointed to the National Committee for Radiation Protection and Management. Big advisory board in this country, and with big impacts around the world. And it's somewhat of a balanced committee. They have some industrial support, and they have some opposing of that support. And so Ed Lewis was put on there with his now new gusto with supporting this LNT situation. And up until that time, the NCRPM was not going to be supportive of a linear dose-response relationship. And so one of his critics, who was on the NAS medical pathology panel, who criticized him, he and Lewis, and there were other members there, they worked out a deal. And the deal, because they're really seeing life very differently. Even though they're both, intelligent and they're fighting over the same data. And what actually happened, and this was groundbreaking, and this is a big in the story, and that was that it came to be that Lewis was forced to admit that he really couldn't prove his case. Okay, and and I have letters with him saying this. He was forced to admit he couldn't prove his case, but he frightened people to the concerns of, well, can you prove me wrong? I can't prove my case, but can you prove me wrong? And so there was this where do we go from here situation. And so what came out of these disputes and these disagreements and these different perspectives was the creation of something called the precautionary principle. And so what happened was that there was the assumption, not the proof, but the assumption that there might be a risk at low doses. And we have to assume that it's true, even if we can't prove it's true, and we will live our lives and make our regulations accordingly. And so what that did was that it led to the NCRPM recommending the use of LNT for cancer risk assessment.
But, so the precautionary principle says we're going to assume harm, even if we can't prove that it's harmful. So in essence, they're saying in order to not take precaution, you have to prove to me that there is no harm. It's impossible to do that in science, to prove a negative like that. Is that?
Well, in general, that's right. There's a sensitivity of the study. You can prove risk down to a certain level. And in fact, that's how we are confronted with epidemiologic studies and cancer risk tied into radiation today. That the Hiroshima and Nagasaki studies at high doses show a variety of cancers have been created, and that's been shown in all kinds of animal studies as well. It's not that that's new stuff. That's high dose stuff. Now the issue is, well, what goes on at low doses? And so people have said, well, what goes on at high, low? It's just proportionality and a one-to-one relationship, and this is where the battle has gone on, and so the epidemiologists make an assumption, and the assumption is lower is always better. We think that there's a risk. We don't really know, but there is an inherent assumption in this belief. And this maybe sets us up for further discussion. And that is that people who adopt a belief in the precautionary principle, and the child of the precautionary principle is LNT. I mean, there's no doubt about it that emerges that way. But when you start to think like that, you might be thinking like an epidemiologist who can only see down to a certain level of sensitivity, or a modeler who is trying to predict effects at low doses. But it's not necessarily thinking like a person who's an evolutionary biologist and trying to understand, how do systems respond under stress and damage. And so what happens if you believe in LNT, and that is you believe more in a static system. You have damage and the damage is fixed, kind of like Muller's piggy bank model. You have damage, it doesn't change, and you just add to that damage. And that's why lower is always better. But what happens if in the course of life, why are we here? We're survivors. All the species on Earth are survivors if you go back billions of years. And so what allows us to survive? The capacity to survive is tied into your capacity to adapt and to repair and to do many other types of things. And so, when you have a cut, well, the cut doesn't stay, unhealed. It finds a way to heal itself. If you have if somebody pushes me, I tend to push back. There's a response to everything. And so, when you take a look at individuals that are damaged, well, the ones who can't repair themselves, they get eliminated from the population. And the ones who can repair themselves, well, then they're there to fight another day. And so when we take a look at what's going on at low doses, yes, systems can get damaged at low doses, but in fact, are we passive players in this game, and do we repair or not repair? And this, in a way, sets us up for 1958, because in 1958, a major event happened, and it was published by one of the members of the the Bayer Genetics Committee, Bill Russell, and what this was in fact something that was earth-shaking, because the Bayer panel, they had assumed the piggy bank model, that all damage was cumulative, you couldn't repair it, and so forth. Bill Russell comes in with his work out of Oak Ridge, Tennessee, working with mice, and he shows, wow, that these mice could actually repair mutational genetic damage, and it basically changed the story.
Thank you for watching the 18th episode on the historical foundations of the linear no threshold theory, where we learned that Lewis's 1959 congressional testimony had false statements in which he described studies as supporting his linear no threshold theory, when in fact they didn't. His boss, George Beadle, acknowledges that Lewis's assertion of a linear no threshold response cannot be proven. This creates a quandary among the radiation protection community. One side supports the long-established threshold model, and the other supports the linear no threshold model. The threshold group challenges the LNT group by stating, your theory cannot be proven in the low-dose range. The LNT group responds by challenging the threshold group to prove that there is no harm in the low-dose range. They ultimately compromise and create what is known today as the Precautionary Principle, which assumes there are adverse effects at low doses even if they cannot be proven. Its application in public health policy is ultimately recognized as another form of the linear no threshold response. In 1958, a major discovery was published which introduced the concept of genetic repair, and it was observed in a mouse study. We cover the fallout from this discovery in our next episode. The HPS is a trusted source of radiation information. We're a scientific organization, and as is offered with the scientific peer review process, viewers are encouraged to send comments or suggested corrections to factcheck@hps.org, and be sure to include your sources so that we may correct the record if necessary. If any changes are made, they will appear at the end of this episode. Please visit our Ask the Experts website to ask questions or seek answers to common radiation-related questions, and view our fact sheets. We also have official position statements that can be found at hps.org. Finally, if you wish to join the Home for Radiation Protection Professionals, please visit the link below. We welcome you.